Hi everyone, and welcome to this mammoth video. In it, I'll be talking about the emergence of a class of people existing in our societies, the Precariat. I will talk about neoliberalism as the cause of this class of peoples, and I'll suggest that a universal basic income should really have been implemented as a way to prevent extreme insecurity, which is the defining feature of the Precariat. I'll also take some time to talk about a coming change in the way our societies operate, thanks to technological advances that you no doubt have already noticed. And I will again suggest that a combination of a universal basic income and universal basic services will be the preferable foundation of that future society. In case you can't tell, I am British. I can only apologise for that error on my part. But because of my error, I'll be placing a lot of my focus on the UK, which is the place I'm obviously most familiar with. Now, it should be noted that I am no economist, which I'm probably going to make extremely obvious. I'm always more obvious about my sources though, which you'll find in the description below the video. If I'm mistaken in my understanding or if any of my extrapolations are too wild, then let me know in the comment section. And let's get into it. It won't have escaped the notice of any paying attention that Western economies have been kind of struggling for quite a while now. While we may celebrate small victories from one month or even year to the next, it's hard not to notice that we have modified the terms of economic success. Where once a sub 1% growth rate was considered basically a recession, now we always measure our growth rates with use of a decimal place. And it's not simply at the scale of a nation that economies appear to be ailing. You, dear viewer, are more likely than not to have noticed a personal struggle in forcing your lifestyle into the increasingly confined form of your wallet. So, what's happening? Well, the first response to that question that pops into many people's heads would maybe be neoliberalism. From the vantage point of 40 odd years later, we look back at Thatcher and Reagan and say confidently it all started with them, and some narratives absolutely make sense with them as a starting point. Ours does too, but it's certainly not as simple as saying neoliberalism equals bad, hypothetical political hegemony of choice equals good. It would be very easy to get bogged down simply talking about this ideology, so I'm going to try and avoid that and instead give a brief and imperfect summary to get us all in the right frame of mind for what follows. Neoliberalism came to be hegemonic at a time of crisis in the late 1970s. Offering a way for governments across the Western world to navigate out of a system already shown to be fundamentally flawed due to the issue of stagflation, which is simultaneously high unemployment and high inflation, among other issues that had characterised the years prior. It wasn't the only solution that presented itself, but it was a solution that had been waiting for a crisis, and the 1970s was offering that in abundance. While the exact definition of neoliberalism may always be a subject of debate, my own understanding of it comes from the political actions of its early implementation, and essentially consists of financial market deregulation and prioritisation, the selling of state assets and the shift from publicly owned services to privatisation, the reduction of workers' rights and their protecting institutions, and, broadly speaking, lower taxes for the richest in society. The early days of neoliberalism, at least here in the UK under Thatcher, were characterised by these actions, with the selling off of large state-owned companies, a reorienting from a manufacturing economy to an economy based on financial services, specifically in London, and the almost destruction of unionised workers' power. This last point is important to us, and is also to Cernicek and Williams in their book Inventing the Future. The subsequent defeat of organised labour throughout the core capitalist nations has perhaps been neoliberalism's most important achievement, significantly changing the balance of power between labour and capital. Initially, it worked, and of course it did. If you suddenly get control of a business, what's the fastest way to make a decent amount of money from it? You sell it. These large state-owned companies like British Telecom were employing a lot of people, and now the state was no longer paying them. And a boost of funds from the sale of BT shares could offer tax cuts for those wealthy financiers moving into the deregulated city of London, where financial services were poised to become so big a part of the British economy that it would employ 1 in 6 workers from London by 1990. Stamping out the power of the unions made it easier to fire high-paid workers and to not risk strikes if you offered only low wages. This had the double benefit of making these previously barely profitable nationalised services seem like appealing privatised enterprises. But also, as spare cash was kept low for the poorest in society, then inflation wouldn't meet the scary heights it had in the 70s, and stagflation could be suggested to be over. The other component of stagflation, eye-wateringly high unemployment, was still an issue, but that was a price that the unaffected were willing to pay. As the gradual success of early neoliberalism, in the form of Thatcher in the UK and Reagan in the US, became apparent, it became the new hegemony for the rest of the Western world too. Sure, there had been obvious sacrifices of huge numbers of people to the new god of finance, and for this reason Thatcher is still broadly unpopular in the UK today. But the data looked better, the graphs prettier, the forecasts sunnier, and that mattered more, frankly. This ensured the hegemony, and neoliberalism would last far beyond the 80s thanks to it. In the same way that a Keynesian view of the economy had spanned political divides in the post-war era, now so too did this neoliberalism, ushered in the 80s by a UK Conservative Party and a US Republican Party. It would be carried beyond the 90s by a UK Labour Party and a US Democrat Party. As the millennium turned then, neoliberalism was an entrenched political hegemony across the Western world. Those obvious sacrifices, the people left behind by a massive societal shift, were still there though. Those who had a settled family with a good, secure job in a mining town in the 1970s may have had their lives overturned beyond repair, still suffering in deprivation even 20, 30 years later. There would always be a percentage of unemployed people even outside these deprived towns, and a percentage of those would never change their circumstances, even if they were desperately trying to. There would always be the sick and disabled, unable to work in a society that often, frankly, tries to pretend they don't exist. In the Thatcherite 80s, they would have called these people the underclass, a term dripping with derision for people unable to meet the acceptable level of economic activity. The Seattle protests that closed out 1999 were just one example of an international outcry against the widening inequality between those benefiting most from the new hegemony and those barely benefiting at all. Guy Standing would give us a new term for these people and the other losers in this new globalised economy, the Precariat. It would include those previously considered the underclass, but more also, and the term itself suggests that most important defining trait, insecurity. They were the sacrifice to the new god of finance, an inevitability in retrospect, a consequence of the tenets of neoliberalism, as Standing explains. One theme was that countries should increase labour market flexibility, which came to mean an agenda for transforming risks and insecurity onto workers and their families. The phrase socialise the risks, privatise the profits comes to mind, but doesn't quite get to the brutal truth of it. You see, taking away the power of unions had been a phase 1 goal of neoliberalism that had been resoundingly successful. Without that power, workers' rights could be taken away with only the barely audible squeaking coming from those people, bizarrely, still paying monthly dues to an organisation that once almost brought the country to its knees, simply to ensure we all wore flat caps and drank 5 pints of bitter of an evening. Well, praise be to Thatcher for putting those people in their place. Now, what were you saying about my wage increase? Well, I guess it can wait till next month. Now, I'm being glib here, I know. The 70s were an economic shitshow, to use the academic parlance, and the unions were flexing in a way that really wasn't helping matters. But stripping their power entirely was never going to be a good thing for workers. In an average owner-worker relationship, the worker only truly has any power in a collective form, and so removing that collective power is inviting exploitation. The end result was always going to be low wages, employer-skewed contracts, and diminished worker protections. Without the leverage provided by unions and collective bargaining, workers are often left to accept whatever terms are offered, however unfavourable. And if you won't take it, then there's always someone more desperate. If no one raised in your country will take the job, then we can start to recruit in other countries. And if we don't want to pay for annoying things like a minimum wage, then we can probably find someone just off a small boat and we barely have to treat them like a person at all. It's a race to the bottom, and it's a long way down. Standing devotes a chapter of the Precariat to migrants, and it makes for grim reading. Of the relation of migrants to the Precariat, he says, "They are a cause of its growth, and in danger of becoming its primary victims, demonised and made the scapegoat of problems not of their making." Whatever country you're in, it's likely this small quote resonates loudly to you now. I don't want to dwell on the issue too long myself, more out of fatigue than fear, but suffice it to say that any punitive attempts to reduce migration end up marginalising people, pushing them firmly into the status of the Precariat, desperately clinging to the fringes of society, ready to be exploited by employers that don't want to meet the higher cost of more legal employees. This, in turn, keeps the market value of legal employment lower than it otherwise would be, and thereby brings more to the status of the Precariat. And it's important for an employed worker to want to stay employed, so the situation needs to be even worse for those relying purely on state-provided social security systems. In other words, our punitive measures will only make matters worse. Here then is those people included in the Precariat: the unemployed, the disabled, illegal migrants and disadvantaged legal migrants, the precariously employed, doing temporary or part-time jobs, those doing 0-hour contracts, interns. This is not an exhaustive list, but it should give an idea of who Guy Standing was talking about, at least in the first 8 years of the millennium. Then, obviously, things got worse. The financial collapse in 2008 was so obvious in retrospect that it's hard to believe it would have been a surprise to anyone at the time. It's worth reminding ourselves that as much as economic history seems like logical progressions, given obvious factors, economic forecasting is really little more logical than astrology, and about as reliably correct. It belongs in the same basket as weather forecasting, in that we pretend it is far more knowable than it actually is. A butterfly flaps its wings and then correctly details the consequences a year hence. Not likely. But whether it was expected or not is really besides the point now. It really sucked. It exposed a lie in the grandiose claims of an end to boom and bust, and laid bare the risks of a globalised economy where one country's policies could cause a collapse in many other countries. I won't be going into the reasons for the 2008 crisis or really examining the crisis itself, but I don't think I'm being unfair to suggest that this is a chickens coming home to roost situation for a world that had been deifying the financial services sector for so long. Right now, I'm much more concerned with how we, and much of the rest of the world, responded to this crisis. The neoliberal answer to economics had been, for 30 years by 2010, to stimulate investment by reducing taxation on those who had the power to invest, the richest people and corporations. This would be coupled with a theoretical reduction of government spending by selling off government assets or the process of privatisation, although that was often a theory that wouldn't bear out in reality. Now, in response to an economic crisis that had seen the deepest global recession since the 1930s, the neoliberal answer was to basically do the same thing. The banks were given vast swathes of money in order not to collapse, and to fund it we were told that, like a household suffering from an income shortfall, the state would need to tighten its belt, to cut its spending so that we can cover our debt, just like you would if you needed to pay off your credit card. After the worst economic crisis since the 1930s, at a time when, according to the OECD, 47 million people were unemployed across the rich world, and the total figure for underemployed and discouraged workers was closer to 80 million, the members of the G20 committed themselves to simultaneously halving their deficits over the next 3 years. It was the householder fallacy expanded to the global scale. It was a recipe for an agonisingly protracted and incomplete recovery. Austerity was the answer provided to the faulty question, who is going to pay for all this? At a time when saying that the economy was limping was to overstate its functioning, the world collectively decided that taking away the crutches was the best solution. Even if economic forecasting is a fool's errand, The result of this decision should really have been obvious to everyone. People already in the Precariat would see their living conditions worsened, making their situation more dire and irredeemable. And many, many more would be pushed to that status. Given that the engine of every economy is the spending of those at the lowest end of the wealth scale, the recovery would be slow and painful, as those people found themselves barely able to afford the essentials. In 2015, Ed Miliband would run his general election campaign with a focus on these effects, noting the struggle to afford the cost of living at that time. Who knows if his proposed solutions would have really helped? Now in 2024, the cost of living crisis is just a regular segment of the news, sandwiched between coverage of the Ukraine war and celebrity gossip. Hiding behind this euphemistic term are millions of people living insecure lives, where one missed paycheck could induce serious material cost, like losing a home. The working class was now the Precariat, and the middle class, those who were threatened with becoming the Precariat, and almost everyone was stretching their budgets. The effects on society of such a large section of the population living an insecure life could easily be the subject of multiple long videos, and it's not a topic that I could adequately cover here, but some of the issues it will cause are probably already well known to you. As I mentioned earlier, lower household spending will more often than not result in low growth or recession. A constant feeling of economic risk will induce more mental health issues in the population, affecting productivity and job satisfaction in the employed, and eventually pushing people out of the job market altogether. A constant feeling of precarity also makes a population ripe for the arguments of populists, offering hate as a solution to anger. This precariat, then, is the cause of much of the problems of today's society, and I genuinely believe that addressing it should have been the primary goal of Western politics in the last decade. It's a complicated issue, with complicated causes and myriad effects, but I think it might be broadly solvable, with some radical thinking. With a reference to similar ideas going all the way back to when we started writing our political ideas down, through Thomas More and Thomas Paine, and via the works of neoliberal forefather himself, Milton Friedman, basic income is an old idea with appeal to a broad spectrum of political ideals. Whether the libertarian, who idealises the free choice of individuals over the paternalist state, the neoliberal, seeking to ensure a consistent engine of consumption at the lower end of the economy, or perhaps the type of leftist that seeks to address extreme poverty while allowing each person to realise their own potential in their own way. It would be foolish to suggest that this is an idea owned only by any particular political wing. It also meets opposition from all wings too, of course. There are plenty of people who believe that they know the only correct way of living, and therefore force paternalistic conditions into any sort of social security system. There are those who idealise the person in the mode of their labour, and therefore see a threat in anything that might jeopardise the domineering position that jobs have over our lives currently. There is, in short, something for everyone, and a fear to accompany it, in this radical idea. Fundamentally, the idea is a regular payment to every person in an economy. There is still discussion on what that means, but you may imagine that it is every adult citizen of a particular state. Perhaps with lower payments for children paid to their guardians. Some people call it simply a basic income, but the universality is a key feature, and so my preference is to call it UBI, Universal Basic Income. The payment should not be means tested. That is to say, it should be entirely unconditional on anything but the very fundamental traits that determine eligibility, i.e., that you are a citizen of that particular state. You can imagine it like this. When you get to the age of 18 years old, every week you receive a small amount of money directly to you, and you will reliably receive that for the rest of your life. The layman conversations often get as far as the cost before becoming thoroughly derailed, so on that issue, I'm only going to say that better people than I have been doing these calculations, and with ultimately positive news. Standing devotes a chapter of his other book, Basic Income, on affordability, and states, as an upshot, Depending on the level of the basic income and the combination of tax increases and cuts in existing benefits, the net cost ranged from an extra £43 billion a year to a saving of £53 billion. The key to understanding how we can afford this is in the name. It is only a basic income and isn't supposed to be comparable to what you consider an acceptable income from employment. Benefits from this system start to show with even very small amounts guaranteed and paid regularly. So what are these benefits? The most obvious and most often lauded feature of a universal basic income is in its effects on poverty. Having a certain amount of money as regular income allows for a reliable budget to be formed for, say, basic food needs or to cover specific bills. You'd hopefully be getting more income from somewhere else, but even if you didn't, you would at least get that basic income. So you'd be unlikely to go the full week without eating a meal, for instance. If properly designed, a basic income should reduce the incidence of poverty, the number of people living in relative poverty, as well as the depth of poverty of anybody in or near the poverty line. Standing is quick to disclaim that this policy alone would be able to eradicate poverty. No policy by itself ever will. But if a basic income policy exists in a community, then we would know that nobody in that community would have less income than that specific amount. As well as addressing poverty in a basic fashion then, it can also ensure a consistent amount of consumer spending at the lower end of the economy. It's all well and good if a luxury handbag sees great sales in wealthy circles, but luxury spending by the 1% is never going to drive an economy in the same way as spending by the other 99%. For a good portion of any population, a regular small basic income will be interpreted as a reliable excess, spending money to be used for treats. It would become the self-imposed spending limit for things like drinks at a weekly friends get-together, collectibles that bring you a little nostalgic joy, luxury consumables that you wouldn't ever otherwise get to try. It's hard to get proof of a positive effect like this, but I don't think it's unreasonable to expect that at times of national economic struggle, a recession could be staved off because people view their small basic income as the luxury they can still afford. In other words, it could become the foundational spending that a national economy might come to rely on, offering slightly more stability to something inherently unstable. This is the dream of neoliberal proponents of a UBI, and if we're going to try and maintain a consumption economy for as long as possible, in spite of the damage it is doing to our planet, then it makes sense to ensure that people have money in their pocket ready to spend. The benefit of UBI that is most pertinent to the topic of this video, however, is the increased security that it offers. Let us reflect on those peoples I included as part of the Precariat earlier. The unemployed and the too sick to work currently receive a certain amount of money to live off, which is conditional on meeting certain criteria like applying for a certain amount of jobs or some other conditions. Those means-tested benefits are always under threat of being removed and therefore keep the recipients conscious of their precarious situation. If they take on a low-waged or part-time job, they could stop receiving benefits and yet earn less money than they got from those benefits while now being employed. If the means-tested conditional basic income that unemployment benefits provide was instead a universal basic income, then employment wouldn't mean a more precarious position for those transitioning from unemployment. Employment wages would always be an increase in income. If you are employed, struggling to get from one month to the next, paycheck to paycheck, so to speak, then obviously an additional guaranteed income might just make the difference between feeling like you're at a cliff edge and just about managing. If you are a housewife or house husband, dependent on the income of a partner, then a guaranteed personal income will mean your sustenance is no longer entirely dependent on a good relationship. As Standing suggests, security is the pivotal key asset, which is probably even more unequally distributed than income or wealth as conventionally defined and measured. It isn't a stretch of the imagination to see how a basic income addresses that unequal distribution of security. Again, just like with poverty, one policy cannot eradicate insecurity, but it will help. There are, of course, other benefits that are often pointed to by proponents of the policy. Some of these benefits are hypothetical, expected but waiting to be proved by the policy's implementation. An example of that might be something like an improvement in mental health for those in the Precariat or close to it. It's something I would expect, but until we have the policy implemented in a way that guarantees incomes for life, thereby removing the expected return of the precarious situation that a short-term test of the policy involves, then we won't know for sure that this is a true benefit. Other benefits have already been observed in the pilots that have been carried out, such as, surprisingly, a reduction of problematic drug and alcohol consumption in the Cherokee Casino UBI. Until this policy becomes practically universal, as in it's implemented in equivalent form in most countries in the world, then we won't really know the full effects, benefits and perhaps negatives that it can induce in a society. But the pilots already carried out are certainly cause for hope. Often presented as an alternative to UBI, there is also a policy named Universal Basic Services that promises to address similar issues, although more explicitly focusing on tackling poverty. Basic services will reduce poverty because they will reduce the cost of a minimum living standard. Even if income levels remain static, it will make accessible a life that includes participation, builds belonging and common purpose, and potentially strengthens the cohesion of society as a whole. These are lofty aims. To break it down, it is essentially an investment into foundational public services, making them essentially free at the point of use. If that reminds you of the NHS, then that's by design. If it doesn't remind you of the NHS, then I'll assume you're listening from outside the UK, and just explain that our health service isn't intended to be understood as entirely free. We pay for it through taxes, and thereby it is said to be free at the point of use, even if we are in effect all paying for it all the time, whether we are using it or not. This is a more cherished institution than the monarchy or even Yorkshire tea for the average Brit, and certainly for me. UBS then seeks to add more public services to the same type of provision. The document I use for research, Social Prosperity for the Future by UCL, highlights healthcare, education, and legal democratic institutions as already being provided free at the point of use, and it suggests adding the following 4 new institutions: shelter, food, transport, and information. Of these 4, transport is certainly the easiest to provide, as it is already provided in the form of a free bus pass for the elderly. The idea would just be to extend that to everyone. Information is suggested to include the BBC TV licence, plus a basic internet and phone package. Basic internet provision was actually a part of Jeremy Corbyn's policy proposals for the 2019 election, so it isn't beyond the popular imagination. The BBC provides an exceptional array of services beyond just basic television, including an excellent recipes website that I'd encourage you to explore even if you were going to eat noodles anyway. Universal food provision is harder to imagine. The stated goal would be to provide 1/3 of the meals for the 2.2 million households, 8%, deemed to experience food insecurity each year. And finally, the shelter aim is obviously an attempt to provide cheap and accessible housing for all. From the current perspective, that sounds like a pipe dream, because our housing market is a complete and utter mess, with seemingly no easy path towards resolution. Let's not get bogged down with how we could do that though, and look at the suggestions as broadly achievable. The authors are under no illusion that you couldn't just click your fingers and have all this utopia implemented tomorrow. The process would take time, and would necessarily be incremental. The purpose of all this is to tackle the problem of precarity from a different angle. If poverty is the difference between the cost of basic living and available income, arguably we've been overly focused on boosting incomes through redistributive tax systems and wage legislation. In other words, instead of trying to increase available income, why not completely collapse the cost of living? It's a neat idea in my opinion. If we could only have either UBI or UBS, as some people often present these options, would a UBS be better? Well, I don't know about that. You might imagine that the end result will be essentially the same. You either have an income that can cover the basic services required for basic living, or you have free access to those services regardless of income. I like either of those options, obviously, but UBI does feel just a little more like an increase of freedom to me. It's an increase in options. You can spend the income this way or that. You can spend it now, or save a little for a bigger purchase later. UBS feels like a post-money solution, like you would never need any money ever again. Maybe it's a failure of my imagination, but I genuinely believe that it will be a problem for the imaginations of many others too, to see a total absence of monetary exchange as a solution to the problems of our society, which is so entrenched in monetary exchange. It feels like a cop-out criticism of the policy, but it is one I think is valid. Are we ready for that? Now, the either-or scenario of either UBI or UBS is thankfully not really being forced on us. In practically every country, there will always be some level of UBS. As I mentioned, here in the UK, we already have healthcare, legal and education as services free at the point of use, and transport is already partially covered. For other countries, there may be a different array of services that meet these criteria. UBI does not necessitate getting rid of or stripping funding for public services, and no serious proponent seems to make that suggestion, with many emphatically asserting that even the majority of current benefits should remain in place. It must be a supplement to the welfare state, rather than a replacement of it. All modern authors I've read that speak of both UBI and UBS recognise that they are complementary systems, not exclusive, and I have no reason to suggest otherwise. For reasons I'll get into in a moment, I think we're trending towards a society where more public services are provided in a UBS-style system, almost as an inevitability, and for that reason, my own focus is on UBI. All of this so far is an examination of what has happened and where we've been. I'm arguing for changes in the future, but only with reference to the past. An oversight of democracy in general is that it always seeks to tackle the problems of now, which are really generated from the conditions of the immediate past. We absolutely need to be looking at what is coming in the future though, as massive changes are definitely around the corner. I know you're all sick of hearing about it already, but watching the stunning rate of technological progress is an indulgent hobby of mine. So I'm going to have to talk about AI and robotics. Things are changing fast, and we should try to keep up to prevent becoming like that person who we all know that has been looking at computers with revulsion since the early 1980s, and are still insistent that they aren't ever going to take off. The term AI will always face opposition because intelligence itself is impossible to fully define, and frankly, it can be left behind and we can say that advanced robotics and language processing software are always advancing and will quickly change the way society works. Because we are, in general, stupid apes addicted to fear and loathing, the majority of society is fixated on how this change is going to make us worse off. So, what's the story there? Well, a combination of robotics capable of any of the movements a human is capable of, and a piece of software capable of sufficient reasoning to carry out a particular task, is a threat to the vast majority of employment that humans currently rely on for income. Let's be absolutely clear, to remove the need to ever employ a human again, you do not need a robot which can carry out all of human movements, loaded with an artificial general intelligence capable of reasoning better than any human genius. We set those things as far off goals further than they really are in my opinion, but we do so only because that's a comfort to us. When really, Retail Bot 5000 just needs to be a basic calculator capable of assessing the goods you are taking and processing payment for them. Employing a human to do that needs to take a lunch break, needs to pee occasionally, needs to sleep every single night, needs to be paid a living wage with additional training, safety, and general HR costs. Well, that's going to become less logical when the price of Retail Bot gets down far enough. We may not call it Retail Bot 5000 in the end, maybe just something like a self-serving checkout. Okay, that's a process of automation that has already begun. Surely it won't take your job. Well, I struggle to think of any single job that couldn't be, at some point in the near future, carried out by either automation software, robotics, or some combination of the two. Automation technology, we must remember, doesn't need to become better than us for it to be the more viable option, because using these technologies means cutting out all the inefficiencies that are inherent to a human. You know, like sleeping, peeing, eating, or whatever. Prices will fall for these technologies, and that will end up being the deciding factor. A robot being the better choice to do your job, in some respects, is almost an inevitability. Now, one response that some people have to this assertion is that past industrial revolutions has shown that significant boosts in productivity create new kinds of jobs that people eventually move into. We lose jobs, but we gain some too. Well, not this time. If we get to the point that a combination of robotics and AI is good enough to do any job right now, then when you come up with a new kind of job for a human to do, at the very same moment, someone is asking an AI to design an automated workflow for that job. It'll be ready to be deployed the next day. There may be some jobs that we will always prefer a human does. I think that's probably true. But they are largely to do with our need for interpersonal, human-to-human understanding, and any cognitive or manufacture expertise will likely be offloaded, readily by employers, to a much cheaper to use computer system. People will become just a friendly face to an otherwise computer-automated body. This sounds almost dystopian, but eventually we will all accept it as logical and preferable. That has been the human relationship with technology forever, and it's where we're headed now. It should be obvious to all that this change could have dire consequences for society, especially when framed within the terms of the Precariat. We've seen high levels of unemployment before, but that'll be nothing compared to an unemployment rate when it always makes better economic sense to use an automated system instead of a human to do a particular job. And we are not very far away from that being the case. While I would argue that everyone at the lower end of the economy in our neoliberal system have been kept in a precarious state beyond any sense of utility to the neoliberal ideology, it is surely not preferable to see unemployment rates overtake employment rates to see the numbers of the precarious increase dramatically. As well as being a dystopian view of the future, it also means that the economy would utterly collapse. I said already that the economy is driven largely by lower income spending, simply by the fact of numbers. No job, no income, no spending, no economy, no income tax, which is currently the largest source of revenue for the UK government. An economic emphasis on jobs, which has understandably been the case since the birth of capitalism, is meeting a new reality. Should we stop it then? Maybe our government should regulate against this new technology. Well, the scenario I just painted is certainly not going to happen, as in, governments around the world realise that they can't afford to not address the big negatives associated with new automation technologies. But I do worry that they address this situation with the wrong aim in mind. Some people, no doubt some politicians, believe that you can regulate away a technological advance. You can't. Not effectively anyway. Sure, a politician can put forward a policy to try and limit the use of automation technologies in a nation's industry, carefully worded so that they don't accidentally outlaw pens or shoes or other technological advancements we've already accepted as human. But when the country next door doesn't go for the same policy, then it won't be long before their productivity boost makes your restrictions increasingly untenable. With AI technologies in particular, a talented computer scientist can make an LLM in their own shed. Code by itself is that cheap, so having a country outlaw it is essentially only ceding the remnants of control that politics has over tech. You might be tempted to categorise this new technology as a tool of this or that politics. You see the constant announcements about AI coming from the mouths of very, very rich people and think that it is their dream being imposed on society. But in truth, a technology is as political as a tidal wave. And just as the wave was not stating its firm anti-monarchism when it surged past Canute, This technological advance is not the agent of any human idea, it's just another force of nature. Those people we might associate with the new technology are really akin to someone in a dinghy floating atop rough seas. If they claim to control the waves behind them, they are lying. The most truthful thing they can say is, "Look out, there's a massive wave incoming." This all still sounds scary, but then there are people, like me, that are hopeful and optimistic about this wave of change. Why is that? Well, I've just hinted at one element. A productivity boost occurs when an industry is able to produce its goods with increasing efficiency. Every industrial revolution is accompanied by a significant boost in productivity, and this one will be no different. Automation technologies have the potential to deliver a huge productivity boost across all industries. That doesn't just mean increased efficiency in the production of cars or whatever, but also in the essential public services that have been starved of investment for so long. The cost to provide health, food, even housing could absolutely collapse in the next productivity boom. And this is why I stated earlier that we are likely trending towards a society where a UBS is inevitable. The cost to provide those services could become so cheap that the economic benefits so massively outweigh their costs. And any canny politician with a pocket full of political capital will seek the goodwill that providing services for free will grant them. And if I believe that UBS will be inevitable, I am hopeful that UBI is seen as a natural accompaniment. There will be no saving a job-focused society when it just makes more sense to pay a few $1,000s for a robot that does the task of any human better and without breaks. It seems obvious to me that, because the current hegemony from which the future will be born is one where having excess funds in your pocket is an economic virtue, the immediate future will be one where providing all with a monetary income makes the most sense. Economically, I believe that it makes complete sense to introduce a UBI, and then it makes economic sense across the full spectrum of politics. But economics isn't the entirety of politics. For some, the very fact that this policy may go some way to eradicating the concept of an adult dependent, because each person gets a private income, that will mean there are some who will always oppose the idea, either out of the fear of change or rose-tinted conservatism. That's just one example, and I'm sure there are more, and I need to keep in mind that a solid economic argument isn't going to be enough for some, and that the woolly promise of increased security and freedom isn't going to be convincing for others. But I think that the arguments for a hopeful future are worth making. We're on the cusp of a new hegemony, and we all need to consider what we want that to be. Keynesian hegemony lasted, 30 years? Neoliberal hegemony has now been going on for 40. It was the answer to a question that's no longer relevant, and in those 40 years it has produced pressing questions of its own. Those being pushed into a precarious existence are being offered fewer and fewer routes out. Now, what follows? Many see the trajectory we're on and suggest techno-feudalism is where we're headed. I won't lie, I see that potential path ahead of us too. This video is a plea to all to set our sights on something better, something just as much within reach. We don't get there just by the power of positive thinking, of course, but we certainly don't get to something better by focusing on, expecting, and preparing for something worse. Dreaming of a future that works for you is the starting point of achieving that future. Thanks for watching.